In the pitch-black Siberian night sky, a large passenger jet bound for Hong Kong was plummeting rapidly toward the ground. At this moment, the only one controlling the aircraft was a terrified 15-year-old boy. Even though the first officer desperately tried to regain control, he was seated too far back and couldn't reach the control column at all. Every minute, the plane was losing thousands of feet in altitude, drawing ever closer to the mountains below. Was this a failed hijacking or a reckless act gone horribly wrong? Why would a commercial airliner flying a routine international route suddenly enter a near vertical dive mid-air? Let's revisit the story of Aeroflot Flight 593. Around 4 p.m. on March 22, 1994, an Aeroflot Airbus A310 was preparing for departure at Moscow's Sheremetyevo Airport, ready to operate a long-haul flight to Hong Kong. The aircraft had been in service for only 2.5 years, with about 5,300 total flight hours. It belonged to a French bank and was leased to Aeroflot. The flight, designated Aeroflot Flight 593, was scheduled to fly non-stop from Moscow to Hong Kong. There were 63 passengers on board. At around 4:30 p.m., the aircraft pushed back from the gate. The flight was expected to take roughly 10 hours. In the left seat was Captain Andrei Danilov, 40, with over 9,600 total flight hours. In the right seat was First Officer Igor Piskaryov, 33, who had logged over 5,800 hours, including 3,100 hours as a captain on the Tu-134. A third crew member was also on board, 39-year-old relief captain Yaroslav Kudrinsky, with 8,900 total hours, including about 900 hours on the Airbus A310. Because the A310 was still relatively new to Aeroflot, none of the three pilots had been flying it for more than 2 years. Both the crew and Aeroflot as a whole were still unfamiliar with this Western-built aircraft, especially its advanced electronic flight control and auto-flight systems. After a short taxi, the Aeroflot A310 lined up on the runway. The pilots advanced the throttles to full power, and moments later, the jet lifted off, heading east. With the aircraft carrying only about a quarter of its maximum load, it climbed quickly, reaching its initial cruise altitude in just 12 minutes. Less than half an hour after takeoff, Flight 593 leveled off at 33,100 feet, steadily following its planned route. Once cabin service was completed, night fell. With more than 9 hours remaining, most passengers settled comfortably into their seats, expecting a smooth, uneventful overnight flight. Weather forecasts indicated calm conditions all the way to Hong Kong, with nothing unusual ahead. 4 hours into the flight, as the plane approached the Mongolian border, everything still seemed routine. Captain Danilov left the cockpit to rest as scheduled, leaving First Officer Piskaryov and Relief Captain Kudrinsky to monitor the flight. But the cockpit was no longer occupied by only the two pilots. An off-duty Aeroflot pilot traveling as a passenger was also inside, along with 2 teenagers. Relief Captain Kudrinsky had brought his son Eldar and Yana on this trip to Hong Kong, and he had allowed them into the cockpit to look around, a clear violation of cockpit security rules. The small space, normally reserved for a few crew members, was now crowded with 5 people, and what happened next pushed the situation completely out of control. A few minutes later, Kudrinsky stood up and invited his daughter Yana to sit in his left seat position. To let her feel what it was like to fly a plane, he changed the autopilot's control mode and let Yana hold the control stick. He then switched the autopilot from managed navigation mode to selected heading mode, allowing him to adjust the heading manually and gently bank the aircraft to the left, creating the illusion that Yana herself was turning the aircraft. At that moment, Yana truly believed she was flying the plane, though in reality, the autopilot still retained full control. Kudrinski then commanded a right turn, and once the plane realigned with its planned route, he switched the autopilot back to managed mode. Flight 593 returned to its original track. Shortly afterward, Kudrinski's son, Eldar, took the left seat. The relief captain repeated the same demonstration, banking the plane about 15 degrees left before rolling it back to the right. But this time, things did not go so smoothly. Kudrinski's son, driven by curiosity, wanted to personally experience what it felt like to fly an airplane. Since the autopilot was still engaged, Relief Captain Kudrinski wasn't worried and agreed. After he reselected the heading and switched the autopilot back to managed mode, he turned around to chat with his daughter, taking his attention off the flight instruments. But at that very moment, the aircraft continued turning right even after passing the assigned heading. A problem was quietly developing, unnoticed by anyone. Unaware of this, Eldar kept pushing the control stick to the right. This resistance against the autopilot triggered the system's control wheel steering override, a feature designed so that in emergencies, pilot input would temporarily override the autopilot without fully disconnecting it. It was meant as a safety measure to let pilots take control quickly if needed. But now, it became the first domino leading toward disaster. Because the rest of the autopilot system was still active, there were no visual or oral warnings to indicate that a human override had been engaged. The pilots, distracted by the visitors in the cockpit, failed to notice anything wrong, busy instead filming videos of the children. Meanwhile, Eldar continued holding the stick to the right. The aircraft's bank angle slowly increased, passing 20 degrees. On the surface, everything looked normal, but a silent tug of war between the pilots and the autopilot was already underway. Since neither pilot was closely monitoring the instruments, it was Kudrinski's son, Eldar, who first sensed that something felt off. He noticed the aircraft was continuously turning, unaware that his own input was causing it. After a brief exchange, one pilot suggested the aircraft might be entering a holding pattern. The other two agreed. A holding pattern is a common procedure, usually used when an aircraft cannot continue along its route and must circle in place. Planes follow a racetrack-shaped loop, typically, but not always, assigned by air traffic control. But Flight 593 had received no such instruction, and no holding pattern had been programmed into the flight management system. All three pilots completely misjudged the situation. Meanwhile, the right bank angle kept increasing. As the wings tilted further, lift decreased. To maintain altitude, the system automatically raised the nose by increasing the pitch. But with the child still applying pressure, the bank angle exceeded 45 degrees, far beyond the recommended maximum of 30. The autopilot had reached the limit of how much control surface deflection it could command. It could no longer maintain altitude. Unnoticed by anyone in the cockpit, Flight 593 began slowly descending. Seconds later, the right bank passed 50 degrees. The nose was still raised, and the angle of attack neared its critical limit. The wings were on the verge of losing their ability to generate lift. Suddenly, the entire cabin shuddered violently. This was buffet, a warning sign of imminent stall, caused by severely disrupted airflow over the wings. At last, the crew realized something was terribly wrong, but before they could understand why, the aircraft's situation deteriorated rapidly. The Airbus A310 pitched sharply upward, reaching the critical angle of attack and stalled. The wings could no longer produce enough lift. The nose dropped violently and the aircraft plunged into a steep dive. First Officer Piskarov noticed the aircraft was still heavily banked to the right, now at 60 degrees. He immediately pushed his control stick full left in an attempt to level the wings. But this action was limited by another Airbus safety feature. On the A310, the two control sticks are normally mechanically linked. Moving one moves the other. But to prevent pilots from unintentionally fighting each other, the system includes a mechanical detent. If the two sticks are moved in opposite directions or with opposing force, the linkage temporarily disengages, and each stick controls only its own aileron. On Flight 593, Eldar was still sitting in the captain's seat, holding the control stick in the near-neutral position as his father had instructed. Meanwhile, the first officer had his own stick pushed fully left. The result, the system split the controls. The first officer's stick moved only the right aileron, while the left aileron remained neutral. The aircraft therefore couldn't generate enough roll correction. Its response was far weaker than expected. Realizing the airplane wasn't reacting properly, the first officer tried moving his stick right, then left again. But in the pitch-black night, with no visual horizon, he and the others became spatially disoriented. They had no true sense of the aircraft's attitude, and even began to doubt their own inputs. As the aircraft hurtled toward the ground at extreme speed, the first officer was the crew's last hope. But controlling the plane was nearly impossible. Earlier, for comfort, he had pushed his seat all the way back, so far that he could barely reach the controls. Though he managed to pull back on the stick enough to disconnect the autopilot, precision control was almost impossible. The cockpit descended into complete chaos. The captain desperately tried to return to his seat, but this proved far more difficult than expected. The aircraft was no longer in a spiral dive, but the violent rolling and tumbling created massive G-forces that pinned the teenager firmly to the captain's seat, making it impossible for him to stand. Seeing the airspeed rapidly increasing, the first officer feared the aircraft would exceed structural limits. He ordered the other two pilots to pull the throttles back to idle. Then he pulled with all his strength on the control stick to arrest the dive and bring the aircraft level again. The plane finally responded. The nulls began to rise. Airspeed decreased, and after a few terrifying seconds, Flight 593 began climbing once more. Still worried about the high airspeed, First Officer Piskarov continued pulling the stick to its maximum, lifting the nose until it pointed nearly straight at the stars. As the G-forces began to ease, the relief captain finally managed to swap seats with his son and return to his proper seat. It seemed as though the nightmare was ending. They were only moments away from fully regaining control. But a fatal mistake was about to be made.
Just as Relief Captain Kudrinsky settled back into his seat and adjusted his posture, he accidentally pressed the left rudder pedal with his foot. At that moment, the aircraft was already in a dangerous state. High angle of attack, low airspeed. This sudden one-sided rudder input became the final trigger that pushed the aircraft past the point of recovery. The plane abruptly rolled over, completely inverted, and plunged toward the ground again, tumbling violently in midair. The pilots pulled back on the control stick with every ounce of strength they had, desperately trying to stop the fall. The altitude needles spun wildly, showing that the aircraft was dropping at an astonishing rate. The crew stomped on the rudder pedals repeatedly, hoping to break the rotation. At last, the spiraling motion slowed, airspeed began to increase again, and the nose gradually rose toward the horizon. Recovery seemed within reach, but they no longer had the altitude. Just before midnight on March 22, 1994, Aeroflot Flight 593 crashed into the frozen hills of southern Siberia, only about 200 meters short of clearing the last ridge before Novonezhdesk. All 75 people on board perished. The tragedy of Flight 593 is a stark reminder that every aviation safety rule is written in blood. Investigators concluded that the relief captain's actions were the immediate cause of the accident. However, the inquiry also uncovered design shortcomings in Airbus's automation system, namely its failure to clearly alert pilots when autopilot modes changed. Critical gaps in crew training were also identified, which prevented the pilots from recognizing the abnormal situation early on. Yet, had they noticed it in time, recovery would have been simple. The investigation showed if the crew had noticed the problem before the bank angle reached 40 degrees, they would have needed only 6 seconds to correct it. And even in the final moments, if they simply centered the controls instead of pulling back fully, the aircraft likely would have righted itself and flown level once more. After the crash, grief quickly turned to outrage. Families of the victims, including many from Hong Kong, filed lawsuits against Aeroflot, accusing the airline of negligence. Aeroflot's insurers initially offered about $130,000 per family, a sum many considered insulting. Several families joined international legal action. A woman in New York, Grace Lamb, sued the airline under the Warsaw Convention. Meanwhile, a law firm in France filed suits on behalf of other families against both Aeroflot and Airbus. Years later, a confidential settlement was reached. No criminal charges were ever filed, but the lawsuits exposed Aeroflot's systemic lack of safety culture and the severe breakdown of cockpit discipline. The disaster also led to lasting, global changes in aviation policy. Airlines around the world reinforced strict cockpit access rules, banning passengers, even off-duty pilots or family, from entering the cockpit during flight. Airbus upgraded its autopilot mode awareness systems to prevent silent mode changes in the future. Russia's aviation training programs added coursework on human factors and automation awareness. Aeroflot Flight 593 began as a father's proud moment, wanting to share the joy of flying with his children. It ended as one of the world's most painful lessons, now written into aviation textbooks everywhere.